The Crimson Nebula cantina floated in the darkness of space like a glowing jewel. Red and orange lights danced across its metal hull, making it look warm and welcoming against the cold stars. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of 100 different drinks and the sound of laughter from dozens of alien voices. Hyunwoo coiled his long serpent body around his favorite corner booth. His green and gold scales caught the dim light as he lifted a glass of purple kelp wine to his lips. The Vilhari smuggler was in a good mood tonight. His latest cargo run had gone perfectly, and his pockets were heavy with credits. 3 other aliens sat around his table, listening to his story with wide eyes. "So there I was," Hyunwoo said, his forked tongue flicking out as he spoke. 2 hegemony patrol ships on my tail and my cargo hold full of illegal spice from the outer rim. They were gaining fast, and I thought I was done for. A small blue creature with 6 legs leaned forward. "What did you do?" Hyunwoo grinned, showing his sharp fangs. "I dropped into the gravity well of a gas giant. Those patrol ships, they were built for deep space, heavy and slow. But my little ship, she danced through those crushing winds like they were nothing. By the time I came out the other side, those hegemony fools were still trying to follow me down." The table erupted in laughter and cheers. One of the listeners bought another round of drinks to celebrate the story. Across the cantina, So-Jin stood near the central bar. Her crystalline body chimed softly as she moved, creating a musical sound that her people used instead of laughter. The Keth engineer was having her own conversation with a group of traders, her transparent limbs catching and reflecting the colored lights of the cantina. "The problem with most species," So-Jin was saying, "is that they think in straight lines. But energy, real energy, it flows in curves and spirals. When I redesigned the power core on my ship, I followed the natural patterns. Now I get 30% better efficiency than the standard models." Her listeners nodded with respect. The Keth were known throughout the galaxy for their engineering skills, and So-Jin was considered one of the best. Behind the bar, Dong-Hyun worked with practiced ease. The purple-skinned Maltese had 4 arms, and he used all of them as he mixed drinks and served customers. Bottles flew through the air as he juggled them, pouring 3 different drinks at once while taking orders from 2 more customers. His regulars cheered every time he pulled off a particularly impressive trick. "1 Andromedan sunset for table 7, Dong-Hyun called out, sliding a glowing orange drink across the bar. "And a glass of that Centauri brandy for the Krell in the back corner." The cantina was full tonight. Beings from a dozen different worlds sat at tables made from the metals of their home planets. Some breathed the standard atmosphere that filled the main room. Others wore breathing masks or sat in special environmental bubbles. A few of the more exotic species floated in tanks of liquid that they needed to survive. Near the back wall, Minho sat alone at a small table. The old Torgash trader had 6 eyes arranged around his head, giving him a complete view of the room. His gray skin was marked with the scars that came from decades of dangerous trading runs to hostile worlds. Tonight, he was drinking slowly from a glass of fermented fruit juice, watching the crowd with the careful attention of someone who had survived too many years in space to trust easily. The cantina's entertainment system played soft music from a dozen different cultures. The sounds blended together into something that was not quite harmonious, but somehow worked anyway. Colored lights moved across the walls in slow patterns, creating an atmosphere that was both relaxing and exciting. A large table in the center of the room, a group of Kelton freighter pilots were celebrating a successful cargo run. The insectoid creatures clicked their mandibles together in rhythm, creating a percussion that added to the musical background. Their ship had just completed a dangerous run through pirate-controlled space, and they were spending their bonus. "Pay on expensive drinks. To the swift wind," their captain buzzed, raising his glass high. "May she always find safe passage through dangerous stars." "To the swift wind," the others repeated, their voices creating a chorus of clicks and buzzes. The Crimson Nebula was neutral territory. No governments claimed the space where it floated, and no military forces patrolled nearby. It was a place where enemies could drink at neighboring tables without violence, where information flowed as freely as the alcohol, and where beings from across the galaxy could forget about the dangers of space for a few hours. Ye-Jin sat at the bar, updating her portable computer with the latest trade information. The Merchant Guild Scout was always working, always gathering data about prices and opportunities across the sector. Her people paid well for good information, and the cantina was one of the best places to hear news from across known space. "Did you hear about the mining operation on Kepler-7?" she asked Dong-hyun as he polished glasses nearby. "The one that hit the gas pocket?" the bartender replied. "Bad business, that. 17 miners lost." Ye-Jin made a note in her computer. Mining accidents meant shortages, and shortages meant opportunities for traders who knew where to find replacement equipment. The atmosphere in the cantina was perfect. Beings who might be shooting at each other in the cold vacuum of space sat together, sharing stories and drinks. The artificial gravity kept everyone comfortable, regardless of what kind of world they came from. The air recyclers worked overtime to keep the atmosphere breathable for the dozens of different species present. Young Dalho, a recent Academy graduate on his first deep space assignment, sat nervously at a small table near the entrance. The human colony ship he served on was docked nearby for repairs, and this was his first time in an alien cantina. Everything was new and exciting and slightly terrifying. He sipped carefully at a mild drink that Dong-hyun had recommended for beginners. The conversations flowed around him in languages he did not recognize, but the universal translator in his ear converted most of it into words he could understand. Stories of adventure, complaints about trade routes, gossip about distant worlds, and the eternal discussion of which drinks were worth the credits they cost. This was what space was supposed to be about, Dalho thought. Different species coming together, sharing the vast universe in peace. The Academy had taught him about the dangers and conflicts that filled the galaxy, but here in the cantina, everything seemed possible. The drinks were flowing. The stories were getting better with each telling, and beings from across the galaxy were enjoying a few hours of peace and friendship in the endless darkness of space. Then the door hissed open, and everything changed. The figure that walked through the cantina door was not particularly tall or impressive-looking. It stood on two legs like many species did, had two arms, and a head with hair on top. Its skin was pale, almost white, with dark hair that fell across its forehead. The clothes it wore were simple and plain, nothing that would mark it as military or corporate or anything special. But every single being in the Crimson Nebula cantina knew exactly what they were looking at. Human. The word passed through the crowd like electricity through water. Some beings whispered it in their own languages. Others simply thought it with growing terror. A few of the younger aliens had never seen one in person before, but they had all heard the stories. Everyone in the galaxy had heard the stories. Yunwoo felt his scales go cold. His serpentine body coiled tighter around his booth as his natural instincts told him to make himself smaller, less noticeable. The three aliens who had been listening to his smuggling tales just moments before were now staring past him at the newcomer with expressions of pure fear on their faces. The small blue creature with 6 legs had gone completely still. Its people were prey animals on their home world, and every ancient survival instinct was screaming at it to run. But running from a human was said to trigger their hunting response, and that was the last thing anyone wanted to do. So Jin stopped chiming entirely. Her crystalline body went silent for the first time since she had entered the cantina hours ago. The musical sound her people made was involuntary, like breathing. But fear had frozen her so completely that even her most basic functions had stopped working properly. The human walked with easy confidence, seemingly unaware of the effect its presence was having on the room. Its movements were smooth and controlled, like a predator that had never known what it meant to be prey. Each step was placed with perfect balance, ready to spring into action at any moment. Dong-hyun nearly dropped the bottle he was holding. His four purple arms shook as he tried to continue his work, but his eyes never left the human. The Maltese bartender had served beings from across the galaxy for 20 years, but he had never had one of them walk into his cantina. The stories said they were unpredictable, violent, capable of terrible things when provoked. At his corner table, Minho felt all 6 of his eyes focus on the human. The old Torgash trader had survived more dangerous situations than most beings would see in 10 lifetimes. But this was different. This was a creature from the death world called Earth, a planet so hostile that its very existence seemed impossible. The fact that anything could evolve and survive there was terrifying enough. The fact that the things that had survived there had then built starships and spread across the galaxy was the stuff of nightmares. The human reached the bar and sat down on one of the tall stools. The metal creaked under its weight, which made several nearby aliens flinch. Everyone knew that humans were impossibly dense for their size. Their bones and muscles were built to survive crushing gravity and constant danger. A single human was said to weigh as much as 3 beings from most other worlds. The conversations that had filled the cantina just minutes before died away completely. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the air recyclers and the soft background music that continued to play, creating an eerie contrast to the sudden silence. Young Dalho pressed himself back against his chair, trying to become invisible. His academy training had covered first contact protocols with dozens of different species, but humans had their own special section in the manual. The instructors had made it very clear that encounters with humans required extreme caution and careful diplomacy. One wrong word or gesture could lead to consequences that entire star systems would regret. The Kelton freighter pilots at their central table had stopped their celebration completely. Their insectoid bodies were perfectly still, compound eyes, reflecting the colored lights of the cantina as they tracked every tiny movement the human made. Their species had excellent reflexes, evolved from ancestors who had to dodge the massive predators on their home world, but they knew their speed would mean nothing against a creature that had climbed to the top of the food chain on a death world. Hai-Jin slowly closed her portable computer and slid it into her bag. The Merchant Guild scout was already planning her escape route, calculating which exit would give her the best chance of reaching her ship before the human decided to do whatever humans did when they found themselves surrounded by potential prey. She had read the reports from the War of 7 Suns, knew what humans were capable of when they decided that violence was the answer to their problems. The human looked around the cantina with what appeared to be mild curiosity. Its dark eyes took in the diverse crowd of aliens, the unusual architecture, the exotic drinks behind the bar. If it noticed the fear that had gripped every other being in the room, it gave no sign of recognition. Near the back of the cantina, a Rigelian merchant actually whimpered. The sound was soft and high-pitched, barely audible, but in the deadly silence it seemed as loud as a scream. Several other beings turned to look at the merchant with expressions of horror, as if the small sound might attract the human's attention and bring down its wrath on all of them. The human turned slightly on its stool, and half the cantina collectively held its breath. But the creature simply looked at the bottles behind the bar, apparently studying the various drinks that Dong-hyun had on offer. Its expression was calm, almost peaceful, which somehow made it even more terrifying. Everyone knew that the most dangerous predators were the ones that appeared relaxed right before they struck. Dong-hyun realized that the human was waiting for service. The bartender's forearms trembled as he tried to decide what to do. Ignoring a human could be seen as an insult, which might trigger their legendary temper, but approaching one could be seen as a challenge, which might trigger their even more legendary violence. Either choice could result in the kind of destruction that would make the cantina's neutrality meaningless. The human cleared its throat softly, and the sound cut through the silence like a blade. Several aliens actually jumped in their seats. The creature's voice, when it finally spoke, was surprisingly quiet and controlled. "Excuse me?" the human said in perfectly accented galactic standard. The language rolled off its tongue like it had been speaking it since birth, which was somehow even more unsettling than if it had struggled with the alien words. "Could I get a drink?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Everyone in the cantina knew that this moment would determine whether they would live to see another day or become another story about human unpredictability that would spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Dong-hyun stared at the human with all four of his eyes, wondering if these would be the last moments of his life. Dong-hyun felt his forearms shake as he tried to process what the human had just asked. A simple request for a drink, spoken in a calm voice, but the bartender's mind was racing through every story he had ever heard about the creatures from Earth. They were the species that had fought the entire hegemony empire and won, not through superior numbers or better technology, but through something the other species called human stubbornness. When the hegemony had demanded their surrender, the humans had simply refused. When their colonies were attacked, they had attacked back twice as hard. When their home world was threatened, they had somehow turned their entire planet into a fortress that no enemy could crack. They were the ones who had looked at a world covered in acid rain and decided it would make a good vacation spot. They were the creatures who had made friends with the void whales, being so ancient and powerful that most species could not even see them properly. They were the people who had taken one look at the galaxy's most dangerous trade routes and decided those were the best places to set up shipping companies, and now one of them wanted a drink in his cantina. What would you like?" Dong-hyun managed to say. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper, and he had to clear his throat and try again. "What kind of drink would you prefer?" The human smiled, and several aliens in the cantina actually made small sounds of fear. Those teeth were clearly designed for tearing meat. The human's mouth was not as large as some predators, but the teeth were sharp and white and looked like they could bite through metal if needed. "What's good here?" the human asked. "I'm new to this sector, so I don't know what you locals recommend." The question was so normal, so casual, that it made everything worse. This was not how the stories said humans behaved. Where was the immediate dominance display? Where was the territorial aggression? Where was the barely controlled violence? That came from evolving on a world where everything was trying to kill everything else. Across the cantina, Hae-jin was frantically updating her ship's computer with the human's description. She was not reporting a threat, because everyone knew that would be suicide if the human took offense. Instead, she was marking this location as having human presence. Some species would pay extra credits to avoid star systems where humans had been spotted. Others would pay even more to visit those same systems, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Death World creatures. The guild had very specific protocols for human encounters. Rule 1 was to remain calm and avoid sudden movements. Rule 2 was to be polite, but not overly friendly, as humans were said to interpret too much friendliness as either weakness or mockery. Rule 3 was to never, under any circumstances, mention their home world or ask about their military capabilities. So-jin found herself analyzing the human's simple clothes and unremarkable appearance. Her crystalline mind was built for engineering problems, and she could not help but see this as a puzzle that needed solving. The human looked so ordinary, so normal, that it had to be some kind of disguise or camouflage. This was not some corporate enforcer in expensive armor. This was not some military specialist with obvious weapons and threatening behavior. This was just a regular human, dressed in clothes that could have come from any of a dozen different worlds, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. If this was what their civilians looked like, what must their soldiers be capable of? If this was how they dressed when they were relaxed and peaceful, what did they look like when they were angry? Minho set down his glass with shaking hands. The old Torgash trader had seen a lot of dangerous things in his long career, but he had never been this close to a human before. The stories said they could sense fear, that they could smell it like a physical thing. He tried to control his breathing and keep his 6 eyes from staring too obviously. The human was still waiting for Dong Hyun to answer his question about drinks. The bartender looked desperately at his selection of bottles, trying to think of something that would not offend the creature. Some drinks were too weak and might insult the human's reputation for toughness. Others were too strong and might be seen as a challenge or an attempt to poison him. "We have Andromedan brandy," Dong Hyun finally said. "It's very popular with travelers. Smooth and not too strong." The human nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds good. I'll try a glass of that." Dong Hyun reached for the bottle with trembling hands. The Andromedan brandy was one of his most expensive drinks, imported from halfway across the galaxy, but he was not about to suggest something cheaper to a human. The stories said they had very strong ideas about proper treatment and respect as he poured the golden liquid into a glass. Dong Hyun tried not to think about what would happen if he spilled it or served it at the wrong temperature. Human reactions were said to be impossible to predict. They might laugh off a mistake that would start a war with other species, or they might take deadly offense at something that everyone else would consider perfectly normal. Young Dal Ho watched from his table near the entrance, fascinated despite his fear. This was his first time seeing a human, and they looked so much like his own species that it was strange. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, similar size and build. But the academy instructors had made it clear that the similarities were only on the surface. Humans came from a world with gravity so strong it would crush most other species. Their atmosphere was a deadly mix of gases that would kill anyone who was not specifically adapted to breathe it. Their weather included storms that could level cities, temperatures that could freeze or boil water, and radiation from their star that would cook most life forms. And somehow, in that environment, they had not just survived, but thrived. They had built cities and civilizations and eventually starships. They had looked at their impossible world and decided that instead of accepting their limitations, they would overcome them. The human took a sip of the brandy and made a small sound of approval. "This is very good," he said to Dong Hyun. "Thank you for the recommendation." The politeness was almost more terrifying than aggression would have been. Everyone knew how to deal with an angry predator. But a polite one, a friendly one, that was something completely outside their experience. What did a human want when it was being nice? The human sat at the bar for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. He sipped his Andromedan brandy slowly, seeming to actually taste it rather than just drinking it for the alcohol. Occasionally, he would make a small sound of appreciation, or nod to himself, as if he was genuinely enjoying the experience. This was not how humans were supposed to behave. Dong Hyun found himself relaxing slightly as he went back to his normal duties. The human had not demanded anything unreasonable. He had not made threats or shown any signs of the legendary human aggression. He had simply asked for a drink, paid for it with standard galactic credits, and was now sitting quietly like any other customer. But the rest of the cantina was still frozen in terror. Yunwoo had not moved from his coiled position in the corner booth. His 3 companions had not said a word since the human arrived, and their drinks sat untouched on the table. Every few seconds, one of them would glance toward the bar and then quickly look away, as if making eye contact with the human might trigger some kind of violent response. The human finished his first drink and politely asked for another. This time, he requested something different, a blue liqueur that came from the ice moons of Titan 7. Dong Hyun served it without hesitation, and again the human tasted it carefully and made positive comments about the flavor. "Interesting," the human said, holding up the glass to examine the blue liquid in the cantina's colored lights. "It has a mineral taste, almost like the water from underground springs. Is it made with ice that has been compressed for a long time? Dong-hyun blinked in surprise. The human was asking about the production process of the liqueur, not demanding information, not threatening anyone, just showing curiosity about how the drink was made. Yes, the bartender answered carefully. The ice moons of Titan 7 have been frozen for millions of years. The pressure creates minerals that give the liqueur its unique flavor. The human nodded with what appeared to be genuine interest. That makes sense. Pressure and time can create amazing things. On my world, we have diamonds that form the same way, deep underground where the weight of rock compressed carbon for millions of years. He was talking about his home world, the death world Earth, the planet that had produced these terrifying creatures. And he was comparing it to ice moon liqueurs, as if they were perfectly normal topics of conversation. So-jin found herself listening despite her fear. As an engineer, she was fascinated by any discussion of how pressure and time could change materials. Her own people created their most beautiful crystal formations through similar processes, though they used controlled environments rather than natural geological forces. "Your people make crystals too?" the human asked, apparently noticing her. "Attention!" So-jin nearly shattered from shock. The human was talking to her directly, asking about her species' engineering techniques. She tried to answer but could only produce a few musical chimes. The human did not seem offended by her lack of words. Instead, he smiled in what looked like understanding. "Sorry," he said. "I know I'm probably making everyone nervous just by being here. I've heard about the stories that spread about humans. Most of them are probably exaggerated, but I understand why they would make people cautious." Exaggerated. He was calling the stories about human capabilities exaggerated. The War of Seven Suns, where humans had defeated an empire that controlled half the galaxy. The Titan Station incident, where a single human ship had somehow destroyed a space fortress that was supposed to be invincible. The thing with the void whales that no one talked about but everyone knew had changed the balance of power in 3 different sectors. All of those were just exaggerated stories. Minho found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "The War of Seven Suns," the old trader said, his voice shaking with age and fear. "That was not exaggerated. My people lost 12 colony worlds in that conflict." The human turned to look at him, and Minho felt all 6 of his eyes focus on the creature's face. But instead of anger or threat, he saw something that looked almost like sadness. "No," the human agreed quietly. "That was not exaggerated. That was a terrible time, and a lot of people died on both sides. I'm sorry your people suffered those losses." An apology. The human was apologizing for a war that had happened before he was probably even born. This was so far from the expected behavior that Minho did not know how to respond. "But," the human continued, "that war happened because both sides made mistakes. The hegemony tried to force humans to give up their independence, and humans responded with more force than was probably necessary. It was not about humans being naturally violent. It was about people making bad choices when they were scared and angry." He took another sip of his blue drink and seemed to think for a moment. "Most humans are not soldiers or warriors," he said. "We're farmers and engineers and teachers and shopkeepers, just like most other species. We just happen to come from a world that made us very good at surviving dangerous situations." Young Dal-ho found himself leaning forward to hear better. The academy had taught him about human military capabilities, but they had never mentioned that humans might be just regular people most of the time. "What do you do?" Dal-ho asked, his voice barely audible across the silent cantina. The human turned toward him with another of those surprisingly gentle smiles. "I study plants," he said. "I'm a xenobotanist. I travel around the galaxy looking at different kinds of plant life and trying to understand how they evolved in different environments." Plants. The terrifying creature from the death world Earth studied plants. Right now, I'm researching how artificial gravity affects the growth patterns of Centauri moss, the human continued. It's not very exciting work, but it helps us understand how to grow food in space stations and colony ships. So, Jin made a small chiming sound that might have been a laugh. The idea of a human doing quiet research on moss was so different from the stories she had heard that it seemed almost impossible. "You seem surprised," the human observed. "We expected something different," Sojin managed to say, her crystalline voice creating soft musical notes. The human nodded with understanding. "Most people do." The human looked around the cantina and seemed to really see it for the first time. He noticed how every conversation had stopped when he entered. He saw how everyone was positioned to keep him in their line of sight. He observed the way beings were holding themselves, ready to run or fight or hide. His shoulders dropped slightly, and he ran a hand through his dark hair. "Oh," he said quietly. "I see what's happening here." He set down his glass and turned on his stool so he could face the room. The movement caused several aliens to flinch, but he moved slowly and kept his hands visible. "Look," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cantina. "I know humans have a reputation in the galaxy, and I know that reputation probably makes me seem scary just by walking through your door." He paused and took a breath. "Some of that reputation is probably deserved," he continued. "Humans have done some terrible things when we felt threatened or cornered. The wars, the conflicts, the times when we responded to problems with more violence than was necessary. Those stories are true, and I'm not going to pretend they didn't happen." Minho found himself listening carefully to every word. This was not what he had expected from a human. There was no boasting about their military victories, no threats about what would happen if anyone challenged them. But most humans are just people trying to get by, same as everyone else in this cantina, the human said. "We have families and jobs and problems and dreams, just like you do. We worry about paying our bills and whether our children are happy, and if we're doing good work that matters." He gestured to himself with both hands. "I'm a perfect example. My name is J1, and I'm probably the least threatening human you could possibly meet. I've never been in the military. I've never fought in any wars. The most dangerous thing I do in my job is occasionally handle plants that might give me a skin rash." A few beings in the cantina made sounds that might have been nervous laughter. "My biggest professional achievement last year was figuring out why Trellian moss changes color when it's grown in artificial gravity instead of natural gravity," Jaewon continued. "It took me 8 months of research and dozens of failed experiments, but I finally proved that the color change is caused by differences in how the plant's root system develops when gravity is constant instead of variable." Dalho found himself actually interested in the research. The Academy had covered basic xenobotany, and the question of how plants adapted to artificial environments was an important one for space colonization. "The thing about humans," Jaewon said, "is that we're not actually the monsters the stories make us out to be. We're just stubborn. Really, really stubborn. When someone tells us something is impossible, our first reaction is not to accept that. Our first reaction is to figure out how to do it anyway." He smiled, and this time it did not look quite so predatory to the watching aliens. "The void whales that everyone talks about? We didn't conquer them or fight them or anything dramatic like that. We just kept trying to communicate with them. Every other species had decided it was impossible to talk to beings that ancient and powerful, so they gave up trying." Jaewon took another sip of his blue drink before continuing. "But humans don't like giving up. So we kept sending messages and trying different methods and learning their language. It took us 40 years of constant effort. But eventually, the void whales got so annoyed with us that they decided to answer back just to make us stop bothering them." Several beings in the cantina made sounds that might have been laughter, though it was still high-pitched with nervousness. Once they started talking to us, we found out they're actually very friendly and helpful. They just hadn't bothered communicating with younger species because they thought we wouldn't be interested in conversations that might last for several centuries. Hyun-woo found himself relaxing slightly in his coiled position. The human's explanation made the void whale incident sound less like a conquest and more like a very persistent attempt at friendship. "That's what humans do," Jae-won said. "We look at problems and refuse to accept that they can't be solved. Sometimes that leads to good things, like making friends with ancient space beings, or developing new medical treatments, or finding ways to grow food on worlds that shouldn't be able to support life." He paused, and his expression became more serious. "And sometimes it leads to bad things, like wars that go on too long, or conflicts that could have been avoided if we had been willing to compromise earlier. Being stubborn is not always a good trait." The honesty was unexpected. Admitting weakness was not something that most species expected from humans. "The point is," Jae-won continued, "humans are not actually trying to take over the galaxy or hurt other species or any of the other scary things the stories probably say. We're just trying to find our place in a very big universe, same as everyone else." He looked directly at Dong-hyun. "And sometimes that means sitting in a cantina and trying drinks from other worlds and learning about how different species make their alcohol. Which, by the way, this blue stuff is excellent. What did you say it was called?" "Titan 7 Ice Wine," Dong-hyun answered, his voice stronger than it had been since Jae-won arrived. "Titan 7 Ice Wine," Jae-won repeated. "I'll have to remember that name. Maybe I can find some to take back to my research station." The idea of a human having a research station instead of a military base was still difficult for many of the aliens to process, but it was becoming easier to believe as they listened to him talk. "Are there other humans at your research station?" So-jin asked, her musical voice creating curious harmonies. "3 others," Jae-won answered. "Dr. Yunho is studying atmospheric chemistry, Dr. Seo-yun is working on soil composition analysis, and Dr. Jimin is our data specialist. We're all part of the same project, trying to understand how terraforming affects native plant life. 4 humans, working together on peaceful research. It was almost too normal to believe." "Do you miss your homeworld?" Dalho asked. Jae-won considered the question for a moment. "Sometimes," he said. "Earth is beautiful in its own way, even if it is dangerous. But I love traveling and seeing new places and meeting new people. The galaxy is full of amazing things, and I want to learn about as many of them as possible." He raised his glass toward the room. "Including the beings in this cantina and the drinks they recommend to curious strangers." As the artificial night cycle of the cantina progressed, something remarkable happened. The fear that had gripped every being in the Crimson Nebula did not disappear completely, but it began to change into something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just the slow realization that the universe was more complicated than any of them had imagined. Jae-won had moved on to his 3rd drink, a fizzing purple concoction that Dong-hyun had described as popular with long-haul cargo pilots. The human had taken a small sip, made a face that suggested it was stronger than expected, and then laughed at his own reaction. "That has a kick to it," he said to the bartender. "What's the alcohol content?" "About 30%, Dong-hyun replied, and was surprised to find that he was no longer afraid to have a normal conversation with the human. "No wonder the cargo pilots like it," Jae-won said. "After weeks in space, you probably want something that reminds you you're still alive." The comment drew a few chuckles from around the cantina. The sound was nervous at first, but became more genuine as beings realized that laughing at a human's joke had not resulted in immediate violence. Hyun-woo slowly uncoiled from his defensive position in the corner booth. His 3 companions were still nervous, but they had begun talking again in quiet voices. The Vilhari smuggler found himself studying the human with professional interest rather than pure terror. "You said you travel around the galaxy for your research," Hyun-woo said, his forked tongue flicking out as he spoke. "Do you use commercial transport, or do you have your own ship?" "I have a small research vessel," Jae-won answered. "Nothing. Fancy, just a converted cargo hauler with some extra laboratory space and a greenhouse section for my plant samples. A single human with his own starship. The implications of that were still frightening, but somehow less so when the human was talking about greenhouse sections and plant samples instead of weapons systems and military capabilities. So Jin had been thinking about the human's research, and her engineering mind was curious about the technical details. When you study how artificial gravity affects plant growth, she asked, do you vary the gravity strength, or do you compare artificial gravity to natural planetary gravity? Jaewon's face lit up with enthusiasm. Both, actually. Different plants respond differently to gravity changes, so I have to test multiple variables. Some plants actually grow better in reduced gravity, while others need the full pull of a heavy world to develop properly. He turned to face her more directly, and Sojin no longer felt the urge to shatter and run. The really interesting cases are the plants that have evolved on worlds with variable gravity, like planets with multiple large moons. Those plants have adapted to handle constant changes in gravitational pull, so they often do very well in space stations where the artificial gravity might fluctuate. Sojin chimed with genuine interest. That would be useful information for space station designers. Most artificial gravity systems have some variation in field strength. Exactly, Jaewon agreed. That's why the research is important. If we understand how plants respond to different gravity conditions, we can design better food production systems for space habitats. Dalho found himself leaning forward to listen to the conversation. This was the kind of practical science that could benefit every species in the galaxy, not the terrifying military research he had imagined humans would focus on. Min-ho had been watching the human interact with the other patrons, and his 6 eyes had noticed something important. Jaewon was not just answering questions politely. He was genuinely interested in the other beings in the cantina. He asked follow-up questions and listened carefully to the answers. What kind of work do you do? Jaewon asked Hyun-woo. The Vilhari smuggler hesitated for a moment. I transport cargo between systems, he said carefully, not mentioning that much of his cargo was technically illegal. Jaewon nodded. That must give you a good view of how different worlds handle trade relationships. I bet you know which planets have the best agricultural products. The response was so innocent and friendly that Hyun-woo found himself relaxing even more. Some worlds do have exceptional crops, he agreed. The grain from Kepler-4 is considered the best in 3 sectors. Really? Jaewon looked interested. What makes it special? Is it the soil composition, or does the planet have unusual growing conditions? Before he knew it, Hyun-woo was explaining the complex agricultural systems of Kepler-4, and Jaewon was listening with obvious fascination. The human asked intelligent questions about crop rotation and soil management and harvest timing, clearly drawing on his own knowledge of plant biology. Dong-hyun watched the conversation with amazement. A human and a Vilhari smuggler were having a friendly discussion about farming techniques, and neither of them seemed to find it strange. As the evening continued, more beings began to approach Jaewon's area of the bar. Not to challenge him or test him, but simply to satisfy their curiosity about what humans were actually like when they were not fighting wars or exploring dangerous worlds. A young Keth engineer mentioned having trouble with her ship's botanical air recycling system. Jaewon immediately offered to take a look at the technical specifications and suggest possible solutions. When Hyun-woo complained about a trade route being closed due to aggressive plant life, Jaewon suggested 3 different approaches that might allow ships to pass safely through the area. You know a lot about dangerous plants, Dalho observed. Jaewon grinned. I grew up on Earth, remember? Every plant on my home world is potentially dangerous. You learn to be careful, but also to understand how they work so you can coexist with them. Is it true that some Earth plants can move and hunt animals? Sojin asked. Some of them, yes, Jaewon confirmed. Venus flytraps, pitcher plants, sundews, but they're not really hunting in the way most people think. They're just adapted to catch insects and small creatures that happen to trigger their traps. He took another sip of his purple drink. The really dangerous plants on Earth are usually the ones that look completely harmless. Pretty flowers that can kill you if you touch them, mushrooms that smell delicious but will shut down your nervous system, trees that produce fruit that looks perfectly edible but is actually toxic to most life forms. How do humans survive in that environment? Minho asked. Very carefully, Jaewon answered with a laugh, and with a lot of knowledge passed down from our ancestors. Human children learn from a very young age which plants are safe and which ones to avoid. By the time the cantina's night cycle was well advanced, the atmosphere had changed completely. Beings were actually approaching Jaewon's table to introduce themselves. Dong-hyun was serving the humans drinks with normal efficiency instead of terrified caution. You know, Sojin said, her crystalline body chiming with what sounded like amusement. You're not at all what we expected. Jaewon smiled. Good. The universe would be very boring if everyone was exactly what you expected them to be. He finished his drink and stood up to leave. The movement caused a brief moment of tension, but it passed quickly when he simply reached for his wallet to pay for his drinks. Same time tomorrow? He asked Dong-hyun as he placed payment on the bar along with a generous tip. For the first time all evening, Dong-hyun smiled back without any trace of fear. We'll keep your favorite stool warm. As Jaewon walked toward the door, conversations continued around him instead of stopping. Beings nodded farewell or called out friendly goodbyes. The fear was not completely gone, but it had been replaced by something the galaxy had never quite associated with humans before. Hope. Hope that maybe the stories were not the whole truth. Hope that maybe the future could be different from the past. Hope that maybe, just maybe, humans could be neighbors instead of just legends. The door hissed shut behind Jaewon, and slowly the cantina returned to its normal rhythm. But the conversations were different now. Instead of the usual complaints about trade routes and cargo prices, beings were discussing what they had learned about human nature. And in communication networks across 3 sectors, word began to spread. Not about human military might or their legendary stubbornness in war, but about something perhaps even more remarkable. Their capacity for simple kindness to strangers in a vast and often hostile universe. The drinks were flowing again in the Crimson Nebula Cantina, but everything had changed. Fear had been replaced by curiosity, and curiosity was the first step toward understanding, and understanding, as every being in the galaxy would eventually learn, was the most powerful force in the universe.